Good evening. Thank you, Craig, for the introduction. I thank the Rio Salado Architecture Foundation for giving me this opportunity, and it's a privilege to be able to be here to present and speak. So very quickly, just a brief background, why this method of practice. So Craig mentioned briefly, I spent 10 years here in America and then some time in Europe, and then decided to go back to my country, back to India, and found that through the method or through the way I had been trained, somehow it was not so easy to build there. Making a set of working drawings, having things all figured out. It was what I realized or came to recognize, in 3 projects that I did initially, that it never got built the way I'd imagined. And more importantly, this drawing set always sat on the table and just collected dust. So that was the kind of beginning of trying to figure out, how does one position oneself, more importantly, in a country where I think there's a sense of chaos, but I use the word chaos more in a constructive way, where, I'm sure if you've visited India or you have Indian friends, this idea of a yes and no. So when you ask a question, you get this nod of a head, and you ask, are you saying yes? And you get the same nod, and it possibly can be a yes and a no. So it's all these sort of aspects that for me, one had to consider. Again, we're a country of 1,200,000,000 people. Just to put things in perspective, the built landscape of the country is really built, outside the framework of what most of us do, the formal profession of architecture. And again, there's a long lineage, a long history that has prevailed and that has, traversed through time, this idea of the action of building. And somewhere maybe embedded in a sort of local, sort of a tacit knowledge which is embedded in the DNA and varies from east, west, north, south. So it's quite complex. And so for me, what I'm going to present is more my own personal journey. It was more a way to find a means to express, using architecture as the tool or the mechanism to be able to communicate certain thoughts or ideas. So anyway, I'm going to take you through this set of slides that in some way might be able to touch upon the complexity of places that I've been working with. So here there's a slide, to the left. It's a ramp and a stair. Again, we've been going through this sort of economic juggernaut that's happened, I would say, that began in the last 30 years. So for a civilization that had moved in small shifts, there were sort of small shifts that took place over a period of time. What one saw in the last 30 years was this sort of rapid movement, an economic movement. And so I'm showing this particular slide, and for me it's of interest because now the household, this particular household has bought a motorcycle or a scooter, and that is driven every day, straight into the living room of the house. It's like a prized possession. But more importantly for me, what caught my eye is this overlap of the stair and the ramp. And the way the two come together is this sort of idea of the overlap. And in some way it displaces, the origin of which one came first. So this I think is a sort of continuing theme that for me is of particular interest, this idea of how do you displace time when you experience something, when you experience, a piece of architecture or an object, a sense of music. Again, the slide or the image to the left, this is in Hampi. This was an image that I had just taken because, it was just a fascinating rock. There was just some sort of an inscription. Of course, much later I found out this is in the southern part of India and an entire civilization that's just been built in granite. Slabs, doors, frames, floors, everything in just one singular material. But more importantly, I soon discovered that these holes that were made, wooden pegs were drawn in, water was poured over the wooden pegs, and that's how they were able to split the rock. Very simple, direct device. this one this is a picture taken in Rajasthan, and we still, I think what's important, again, is this idea of tradition. I'm not nostalgic about tradition or have a preference to one or the other, but I think my interest has been in looking for a bridge, some kind of an overlap. So the potential of these two systems, if you want to call it, tradition and economy that's come in and that's creating a sort of change. And for me here, the idea is more this idea of an overlap where the two potentially can meet. So they come together and move away, come together, move away. So the image here is these pitchforks. We stopped to buy these pitchforks, very precise objects or mechanism that really is an extension of the hand, used in agriculture, still used. Uses a tree that's that is just heated, and then the forks are bent. But what was interesting was I saw this gentleman that I was buying it from, the gentleman in the yellow T-shirt, and I go up to him, and give him the money, and while I'm giving him the money, I ask him, how come you're the only one dressed here? All your peers or your colleagues are dressed in this classical white linen vest. Actually, it's like a T-shirt. And he said, well, there are all these companies, these salesmen, these traveling salesmen, and they come and give us these things. So I couldn't really argue with him. It's a cotton T-shirt, works in the kind of desert climate in Rajasthan. And while I was giving him his money, he takes the money and then dips his hand in this T-shirt. And I said, wow, how did you do that? So he kind of looks at me with the same smile, and says to me that I took it home, my wife cut it up, and she stitched this beautiful pink satin lining in the pocket, much like a Lucio Fontana cut. The reason I'm showing you this image is that oftentimes it has been considered, when there's this sort of rapid change, the speed at which things are moving, there's this sort of, how do I say, maybe a fear of this change, this incredible accelerated change, that we somehow develop a resistance. And for me here, what's fascinating is a kind of a lack of a prejudice, where one would have imagined a space that was necessarily closed, this idea of commercialism that has come in some way, influencing the culture of the place. And for me, the interest is the ability for both to coexist, that just by this cut, both the advertisement on the T-shirt and the pocket can both still coexist together. So for me, this is really what we're seeing importantly in our country. This is just an image of our studio. This was in Alibag. We've now moved this in the last few months. We've moved back to Bombay. But it's a place, at one point we were working with about 200 artisans, carpenters, masons, plasterers. And again, a lot of this was all communicated through gestures, through the idea of action of storytelling, the idea of movement, and of course, between the yes and no. You'd ask a question on a Monday, and you get a sort of strange answer, and you ask the same question on a Wednesday, and they say, how come you didn't ask me this question earlier? It's always these situations. But anyway, this is more like a laboratory, this space that I'm showing you. This particular slide I like in particular, and the question is, this describes the idea of postures in architecture, and this I discovered when we were in Venice, and we were to do this black screeded floor, and most of the guys with us at that moment were carpenters, and they weren't really plasterers or sort of floor specialists or masons. And we had an Italian crew, and they brought a can and said, we can do it from here, and it sort of didn't make sense. So I think we all collectively got together and said that I think maybe we can do this. But more importantly, what it meant was that we actually had to sit on the floor and work our way on the floor for about 2 hours. There was a young American and myself. We didn't quite make it down to the floor. We were up in 30 seconds. So the question I ask is, that maybe, it's not necessary that materials or techniques vanish, but maybe the posture that we take and our inability in the posture that we take, that these processes are not prevalent anymore. Again, for me, what's of interest is the distance of the person making and what is being made. That is, whether it's the stone or the wood. And again, this idea of speed, the idea of proximity, the idea of change. And again, this same idea could be used, I think, also with machines. I think what happens with machines is just that the distance that one has to travel, or the distance traveled, is far greater. So and the speed at which it occurs is far greater. So I think it's all about negotiating that space that lies in between. So anyway, this is a particular slide that for me is of interest. Another one here is the idea of water. More than 500 million people in India actually still go to the source of water. There's an idea of ritual, be it a stream, a river, a pond, or a local well. There's still a large part of the population that goes to water. So these are just sort of atmospheres and ideas of, what it is that generates what we are calling architecture. What is it that in some way is a seed for the making of these things? So I'm going to start with the project. It's a house for 3 generations. This is in the southwest coastline, south of Mumbai. And it's a house for 3 generations. We found this sort of dig in the ground or a hole, but it had sweet water. It's barely, maybe 30 or 40 meters away from the ocean. And what was important in some way was to retain that as the center, much like a belly button. So maybe towards the latter part of the slides, the house is really a gesture where it's sort of like a ring like that, and it protects this belly button, and it constantly nourishes that sort of seed or nourishes that source. Again, my local engineer, there's a lot of, the gentleman here with the hat is a master well builder. And oddly enough, at the age of 20, while he was learning to build a well through, I guess, his father and his grandfather, fell into the well. And then pretty much spent the rest of his life mastering this idea of just well building. So it was important, and here there's through the action of drawing and gestures, but what was more important was that it was a small fissure, barely a few inches wide, that had to be protected, and we had to sort of build over that, build in sort of like an archway, protecting that fissure that actually allowed the water. And it's quite interesting because what was important here was that it wasn't today, or it wasn't 10 years from now, but a settling that could potentially take place over time, that could at some point, reduce that gap of that fissure that allowed the sweet water to come in. That's the community that's involved. He's up there directing everybody, and it's fairly straightforward, just in the sense that this action normally takes place in the month of March in mid-March, because we have the monsoons in early June, so we are able to hit the lowest water table. And that's a section that was made, so you can see that's the sort of the navel of the house, and then you have this peripheral set of rooms that sort of surround the central space. This is a space, it's a water space. It's the well that actually feeds the house for water, the plants for water. And this is a picture taken in the rains. And you can see the level of the water. And then I'll flip to the next slide. And then this is taken in the summertime. But more interestingly, the image to the right registers this sort of, you see this kind of watermark. And that was the level of the tide so we took this picture maybe 2 hours before the water had settled. And this is something that I discovered actually in the moment that this picture was taken, that this was actually a living, breathing vessel. And in some way, the idea of this enclosure, you were about 50 meters from the sea, but the presence of the ocean was far greater than just the idea of the visual. So again, it brings up the question of, how do we read architecture? And for me, it's interesting that It's the five senses, and a sixth one that we call intuition, or for me, I like the idea of anticipation. So again, here it's the view that's taken away, but the presence of the sound, or the presence of the tide that is registered, that in some way creates another kind of overlay, another kind of image of the experience of the ocean. Again, I like this idea of ebb and flow, high and low. And again, importantly in India, come the monsoons, there's a large exodus of people going back to their villages or towns, and you could pay them any amount of money, but this will not stop. So this idea of also the movement of the population, which has an ebb and flow based on a seasonal cycle. One of the things that I wanted to touch upon, and for me, which is fascinating, is this idea of lunar time and the idea of Greenwich Mean Time. And I think fundamentally, all of us globally have come from the idea of lunar time, that is a time that's based on the cycle or the relationship of the sun and the moon. And Greenwich Mean Time is, of course, much recent in the last 500-600 years, and that's what we all fundamentally now work with. But somewhere embedded in our DNA, we also have this other aspect of time. And that, for me, is the point which is of interest in the potential or the idea of how they overlap, and the system of priority, of how you give one priority over the other. And this is a sort of constant communication and a conversation that goes back and forth. That's the plan. And you can see, so there are 3 families, and each one has a corner. The dark spaces in between are the public spaces or the meeting point. And those holes that you see there in the courtyard, that's where actually all the water then funnels back into recharging this well. So effectively, again, the idea is that the house might come down in time. The house would slowly, dismantle itself. But what remains is this well, this water well, and the idea of like a civilization. So you have the potential to rebuild, to reclaim this water source. So I think, again, for me, what's important is this idea of mimetic structures, the idea of mimetic buildings, where we have the potential in what we do, and the idea of mimetic being that these are, models of evolutionary cultural transfer, that the idea that architecture has that kind of potential. This is a project up in the Himalayas. It's about 8,300 feet. A client of mine who is a writer and a travel writer runs a travel company and wanted to set up a small lodge where he could take travelers up there and then take them into the higher Himalayas. So that's the site, the plateau. I don't know if you're able to see the drawing. So the project is basically a travel lodge. It's 4 rooms that are set on an agriculture piece of land. Up here in the mountains, you're able to lease the land. So the land was leased from the local farmer. But the condition was that there was nothing to be built there permanently. And it was a 10-year lease, and the idea that they could return the land back the way it was at the point that we acquired it from the local farmer. So again, what was important here, and at the time that we built this project, there weren't any mobile phones up there. Telephones were difficult to come by. So a lot of it had to be done on the basis of what the locals knew. And again, building up in the mountains, this is a technique that has been developed, over hundreds of years. So there's a sort of, again, an immediate tacit understanding of the local materials, the spans, the dimensions, the weight, the density, the mass of the material. So it was important that we worked, because 50% or more than 50% of the work had to be done locally. We had a young site architect, but it was also based on certain rules that were set up, just sort of these frameworks of ideas of dimension and height. So here you can see just the way things were transported. So it's a good 8-hour drive from the plains up into the mountains, and then it's a 2-hour walk. And a lot of the building material has to be carried this way. The timber came is actually from the region, but is sold in the plains. So we actually, fitted it out at the workshop, dismantled it, and then transported it back up onto site. So this is just an image showing you just the way things were transported. And here you can see again the immediacy of the materials. The stone is barely 500 meters away, brought here, and then the construction is fairly direct and immediate. And what's quite interesting here is that this is fundamentally an agriculture and agrarian society. So when they're not doing agriculture, they're either repairing the houses or repairing their villages. So there's this idea of a continuity of building and cultivation. I think that's prevalent in most parts of the country. Again, I want to bring this up is that most of the building actually happens just immediately after the rains. And often in the monsoons, which are about 4 months or 4.5 months, most of the construction work either slows down or in certain places like here up in the mountains, not much is built. So in a sense, you also have to kind of build with the seasons. And that there's a certain economy, large machineries are not required. So anyway, this slide just demonstrates that. It's all dry stack masonry. Walls are barely, I would say, 7.5, 8 feet high. And then a timber frame is set on it with a plywood sheeting, and then a canvas that's been stretched on a sort of rigid frame. So here you can see the different seasons and the different qualities of the landscape. Again, here what was of particular interest was a sense of a lightness, I guess, and all the measurements were taken on the basis of what a person could carry. So if you did see the earlier image where you saw the porters carrying glass and wood, it was sort of based on that dimension of a human and how much one could carry. So again, this idea of lightness or weight was considered in the way that the project was actually drawn out or measured. I like this particular slide, and it's an important aspect because, again, a lot of the projects are based on this idea of stories or this idea of mythical stories, something that could have existed or will exist or has existed, this idea of past, present, future, and being able to move seamlessly between these three aspects of time. So here I'm showing you this image. Actually, this was an image taken during construction. But this is how we would be returning the land back. These series of retaining walls and steps that negotiate the terraces. And in some way, and which you often do see in this region, small settlements that have been abandoned that could potentially be reclaimed. So that was really the basis of the project in the way that it was conceived, this idea of the action of foundation that I think is, for me, a very primary resource in understanding how the building then emerges out of the ground. And the sense of, when I use the word weight, there's a sort of sense of space that's built into when you measure the weight of the building. This is for the same client. It's a house, again, south of Mumbai. It was in a thicket, a large, thick grove of palm trees. This was an old agricultural belt that traded with Africa, pepper, cinnamon, spices that were grown normally on these trees. It was once a tropical rainforest that that was felled, about 100, 150 years ago. But it had this incredible dense plantation. What was interesting here was also the fact that there was a sort of colonnade and an architecture that already defined the nature of that space. So in some ways here, what we were negotiating was more the rain and the wind more than the sun. So what we've presented, or what we've positioned here, let me go back. Again, these are images that we take on a day-to-day basis. Every day, either one photo, a model, a drawing, something is made at the studio. Some action of one of these parts is made. So we work between the digital media, between hand drawings, between drawings made out of tape, between models, between a full-scale mock-up, and it's this constant movement back and forth between all these different dimensions that we're exploring. So again, just things that we observe in the landscape that in some way have a way to enter into the project, so give clues into the project. Here you can see a full-scale mock-up. I'm not sure if you can see there's this sort of lines that dimension the project. And again, the idea of an action of survey. It was only by placing this sort of wireframe diagram of the project made out of the same betel nut or areca nut palm, which normally grows for 30 years, but some of the older ones were felled, and we made this frame structure. But it allowed us to understand the rhythm or the manner in which these coconut palms had been set. And what we discovered, there was an average dimension of 15 feet, a range between 13 to 15 feet that we found between the trees. So what appeared to be a sort of chaotic organization actually had a system. And right here below that is our working model. It's a sort of working drawing model, if you want to call it that. So you can see the tape, and there are measurements written on that. And this is, again, built, this model is built by the carpenters who are actually building the house. I had to do this kind of technique because if you set with a series of drawings or a series of instructions, the moment you give a series of instructions, they follow them as instructions, as opposed to where you just give them enough material where the craftsmen or the builders have to actually engage the action of taking out a ruler, measuring the model, checking it, and then there's a rhythm in the way that the structure is built. So again, these are devices that we use or we continue to use to build our projects. And you can see there are two bars that are set between the palm trees, and the position actually comes based on the location of the trees. And one is slightly, moves slightly further out than the other, and more as a gesture of nudging you kind of into the space between the two elements, between these two long wooden structures. These are all the devices, models, stair models, details, intersections. What's of interest is by doing these over and over and over again, when we're actually at site, there's a sort of rhythm that is set up. The people that are involved in the building immediately know what has to follow next based on what they've done. And again, a lot of these materials remain on site as a reference tool. So again, for me, what's of interest is to develop a typology and a building system that I think in some ways is inherent to the tacit knowledge, but also works between the idea of the familiar and unfamiliar, where in some ways, developing a conduit where the craftsmen or the builders have to move, and me at the same time have to try and move closer to them. So it's a sort of back and forth movement, this idea of a bridge where we're able to move back and forth and find a third space, find a space which is not necessarily the builder, the craftsman, or the architect, but a combination or a collection of all these facilities together. So anyway, these are just tools that I'm showing you that enable us to build in the way that we're building. Again, here, this was another thing that was something that I discovered, this idea of, we are constantly preoccupied with this idea of the inside and outside, and how we make that connection. And just like in the project with the well, here I discovered that I had an opportunity to stay in the house, and it was, I think, on a day of a full moon. The shutters were all shut, and it was quite impressive in the sense that I soon discovered that the light actually reflecting through these louvers, because there's no glass in between the louvers. It's just louvers, and air, light, and sound kind of passes through it. So in this sort of closed space with no window to the outside, what was of particular interest was the sound. The atmospheric air that you registered outside was exactly the same as you registered inside this internal volume. So it sort of raises the question of, this idea of inside and outside, that potentially outside can actually be inside, also in a metaphorical way, and that inside can be outside. So this was something that also is a recurring idea of, how does one draw the idea of interiority and exteriority into architecture, and what is considered as interiority and exteriority in what we do. Again, here we used just something that I want to touch upon very quickly, is that we used 3 sheets of plywood. So the dimension of the space in between of these bars is exactly 12 feet. 3 sheets of plywood, 4, 4, and 4, and that gives you an average of 12 feet. So we were able to negotiate that measurement of 15 feet, and we were able to slide these buildings very easily into the gaps that were provided between the trees. Again, this idea of actioning between the idea of industry or mechanism and the idea of making with hands. I'm not nostalgic, or I'm not particularly I won't say fascinated, but for me, the idea of the hand, it has a certain immediacy, just like the way we'd make a drawing. But the fact that we've been coded, our hands have been coded, the first actions of language were the gestures of the hand. So it's something that has been of a certain interest or preoccupation. And how does one find another language, maybe in these times where the idea of mechanism, industry, the idea of speed, how do you gain agility? How does one negotiate these changing times? So anyway, these are just topics or things that are of interest, and in some way we try and weave them into the project. This is how I'd imagined the project at the inception. Again, most of us, it's always an illogical decision. There's no logic to a decision that we make when you first go to site or the second time you go to site. But this idea of these 2 glowing boxes, this idea of 2 lanterns that emit their own light and in some way also in the evening reveal another kind of landscape. This is a project in Mumbai. We're a population of 22 million people, and you can see this is Mumbai in the last 10 years and growing rapidly. Just very quickly. So that's the site. Our studio now is housed in here. It was an old warehouse, a go-down that stored tobacco. It caught fire in the 80s. The roof came down, and these trees grew. What you have on the other side of the railway tracks, or to the left, we have about a 46-acre site, which is a green. It's the only sort of large green zone in Mumbai, which actually houses the zoo. And interestingly enough, there are these bats that fly every evening. They take this route, and it's the bat droppings actually that created this landscape within the precincts of the wall of the warehouse. But anyway, the idea was that a group of 6 people, purchased the land, and it had to be subdivided in different dimensions or different square feet. And for us, what was important was to, in some way, develop a typology that could negotiate east, west, north, south, and then also in some way open up a space where the potential for the idea of regenerating the landscape, that if we had to abandon this site, nature, and I mean it in a sort of very broad spectrum, could in some way reclaim or re-inhabit the place. So again, the idea of the openings where the roof actually takes the water back into the courtyards. I'll show you let me just go back up. If you can see, the adjacencies of the property have actually been occupied. These are the setbacks. So if you took a cross-section of Mumbai, or if you took a map of Mumbai, the official map of Mumbai, and you drove around or you experienced Mumbai, they wouldn't match, because more than, I would say, 40 or 50% of the city is occupied, if you want to call it illegally, or but that idea of between, again, the yes and the no, what's allowed to remain, or how you inhabit a space, is all a very fine line of this idea of visibility and invisibility, or being discrete. I think that's the more precise word. So it was important that we weren't able to build back the A-frame roof, because it meant that all the water from the roof would be shed to the neighbors. And if that was to happen, the project would never get off the ground. So the only device we could use to introduce the roof was actually take the roof back inside. And in the process, we were able to draw light, air, and rain. And in the process also, the idea that we could regenerate the trees back from the courtyard. I've drawn this particular drawing more to describe the idea of light, but more describing it as sound. I think we've all experienced the South American flute that has these different tubes. And as you play through those different tubes, you get these very particular kinds of sound. And in the same way that you would walk through this sort of long loading dock, which was once a loading dock, but this long street. And as you move through that street, your head naturally would move from side to side as you brush past the openings of these courtyards. And the quality of the light and the space would render a particular kind of tonation to say. So here it's more a diagram, more to describe the sound of the place more than the quality of the light of the space. So that's what it is from the outside, and this is now we've just recently planted. It's just been one season, and that's actually how we found the site. Unfortunately, some of these walls were in disrepair, so they had to be taken down, and along with that, some of the plantation that was there. The proximity of all of this was quite tight, but it was, again, our motivation was to in some way regenerate the landscape that was once occupied this particular place. Again, here for me, what's of interest in this corridor is this meeting of the natural, or of nature and the city, where you have this. I think it's like a schism that takes place when you turn to the east. You just have the depth of field of the sky, of the stars, of the moon, of the sunrise, and when you turn back west, you have the city that's framed, and it sits right in the heart of the city. So this sort of duality of the place, the duality of this experience of the idea of infinite, of one being nature and one being man-made. These are a series of drawings that were developed. I'm going to quickly go to the next slide, and we call them tape drawings. This was actually because we have a very heavy monsoon. Humidities are 99%. Getting a drawing off a printer, an A1 drawing off the printer, by the end of the rains, you don't actually have paper in your hands, it's just shredded. So the guys in the studio developed, we had all these sheets of plywood, that were sort of discarded, and they took masking tape and used masking tape to put on the board. And the masking tape is then cut away, and then also you can draw on it. So it's very easy to make corrections. But what we soon discovered was we could actually start making full-scale drawings very easily. There was a sort of immediacy to this idea of the masking tape, and I can just show you. So this, what you see, is actually our drawing set. All those boards that you see there, that's our drawing set. And if you notice carefully, there are no dimensions. To give dimensions, big mistake, right? Because what it does, it takes away the ownership from the person actually making the thing. Because it's what's immediately that comes to the forefront is, but that's what you have written. So again, this idea of being able to draw somebody into a conversation, to draw them into a communication, and the idea that we have the facility, all these tools to in some way construct images, construct sort of stories, and there's a kind of motivation that actually draws them into this kind of construction. But importantly, the guys actually building it were the guys who made the drawings. You know, something just of interest. So that's part of the space that's being completed. So my studio, our studio is housed here. Again, it was interesting because we had to also deal with planning permissions. I'm often asked, how do you deal with, these, because somehow, miraculously in India, I think anything goes. Yes, anything goes, but it's all very relative. And it was important. So part of these walls, we were given a sort of 3 or 4 month period where we had to build the walls in brick. There was no real detail, so whatever the guys knew how to build, they just built with a concrete frame, 18-inch thick brick wall, because that's what was there. And of course, the guys, would you call them? The local council, they came in and they said, but your bricks are new. So they said, well, we're giving you 2 days, figure out what you can do with your bricks. So we kind of had to take charcoal, was the best way to actually we rendered the entire facade with charcoal. And of course, that's what allowed us to pass the project. So yeah, it's all these sort of nuances that are very, very particular. And I'm sure they do occur here. I mean, I know that they do happen in other parts of the world. But that's another conversation maybe towards the later part of the lecture. So just here, I'm just showing you images that describe the quality of the space of the courtyard. Again, a lot of the engineering, and this is something that for me is of particular interest, is this idea of spans, the idea of dimension. So oftentimes what we do, or what I do, is do consult an engineer. It's not that one doesn't have an engineer, but we discuss it more as in the same way that one would work with the craftsman, more in terms of an idea. And then we draw everything up, all the way from foundations up. It's all drawn out and then presented back to the engineer. But a lot of the engineering of these projects is actually done in-house. And this is something that also I found of value, because then it allows us to remain very close to the conceptual idea, very close to the kind of expression that one wants to create. So just again, very quickly, a lot of these projects in some way have, or in more ways, have been all designed and developed, in-house in the studio. Of course, that's a much later. This picture was taken a few months ago, and of course now the roof on all the spaces has come off. This is an exploration. The next few projects I'm going to show you is an exploration that also, in some ways, dealing with gravity. I think that's the fundamental force, and I call it the only true egalitarian force that we're all confronted with, I think, globally, this idea of gravity. And the question of, what does one do with this idea of gravity? In some ways, the whole aspect of the force is to sort of, completely pin you down and sort of demobilize you. But somehow, some way, we have the ability to negotiate this force. And so here, what I'm presenting, we make these sort of pieces that really are not, they sit in between, I would say, just the idea of making objects and architecture. But I'm showing these two. They're all made out of tar, like pure tar. And part of this is also just discussing this idea of, the infrastructure that is being built, in India, but I think across the world, I mean, all over the world. And in the process of this infrastructure that's being built, objects of culture, objects of civilization in some way are either being cut out, are being obscured, are being overlaid, as these highways that are being built. So the tower in some way is something that it's kind of like a lava flow, but the only thing is that this is a man-made lava flow. It also has the same sort of the temperature at which the flow occurs is quite similar. But here what we're trying to demonstrate, because as these objects are put out to the temperature, to the seasons, to the rain, to heat, they in some way start, changing their form. And through that, there's an object that potentially is revealed, and you could reference it in. So each one will have a different kind of an interpretation. All of us could look at these things in different ways. So it's this idea of flux, this idea of working with flux that we're interested in the studio. So the next set of pictures, this is a house, again, for 3 generations, it's one family, but, 2 sisters and a brother who in turn have, families. It's much like an Italian family where we have, our families are quite large. So this is the roofscape of the project. It's built in brick. This is the first project that we've actually done, which, again, there's no cement or concrete used for this. All the materials in this project are edible, oddly enough, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So you can see how it's set. There are 9 boxes that are there that are set between the trees. And more importantly here, the force of the project is actually at a diagonal, because that's the contours actually run in a diagonal. The flow of the water is at a diagonal. So the way the boxes were set considered the sort of flow of the water as it ran down the hill, in some ways not to obstruct it. And then, of course, because of the rains, these 9 boxes are connected by a patio, or like a veranda space, which sort of joins these 9 boxes, and that's used as the transition and the public space of this particular project. That's where we got the idea for the roof. It's a waterproofing that was made for boats, goes back to the Sumerian age, that sort of dates back. We still have this kind of industry still available, and actually, oddly enough, you could find this pretty much anywhere. The seeds do exist in different forms, but it's all made from seed sap and mixed with certain kinds of mixes, again, that are all organic. Why this method? For me, it was important because there's a directness. If there's something that goes wrong in the monsoons or over a period of time, it facilitates the owners or facilitates the occupants to quite easily engage with this method of protecting their house. So this idea of the house being looked after, once in a while over a period of time, where you develop an understanding of this idea of the envelope or the boundaries of your building. Doesn't mean that it takes away that the house is not waterproof, but I just like the immediacy of this material. So it's very easy. Here, I think, again, the reason I bring this up is that I'm interested in this idea of what if you could give 4 dimensions, length, breadth, height, and structure as a set of instructions and potentially be able to build something. In here, I didn't have to worry about flashing, complex, metal flashings and joints, and there was a sort of directness where you can see there's a line registered where it overlaps on top of the plaster. So there's, again, this idea of trying to pull away, not because of being lazy or not wanting to do the drawings, but as a method to be able to communicate quite seamlessly, quite easily, and sort of bring a larger group of people into this dialogue of building. So this entire project is built in lime, brick, stone, and wood. Just to give you an idea, and on the outside, we had to plaster this particular project because it rains quite heavily, so it's a 9-inch brick wall, and I'll show you maybe I'll show you images of the kind of wall that we've made here. It's called a rat trap pond, which basically takes a 4-inch, 2 bricks, 4 inches with an inch in between, but you flip it and you get an air gap, and then the other brick goes like this. So it uses less brick. You get an airspace, or you can fill the airspace with lime and the debris from the construction, acts as an insulation. So that was really, and it's just fairly straightforward. The boxes are barely, 13 to 14 feet wide, easy to span, and the distances in between these boxes also are of a dimension of 7 to 8 feet. So again, as you see in the walkways, I'm looking at the wrong slide, you can see in these walkways, there's no foundation below those columns, in the sense that all they're doing is actually taking a vertical load down, because most of the roof is actually anchored to the brick boxes. So there's a sort of lightness to the columns. But part of that was also to enable the water to cut through. So you're seeing this sort of diagonal axis coming towards me in the picture, this idea of the water. So the roof is all registered at the same plane, and just by the undulation of the ground, it basically gives a hierarchy to the spaces that are held in the volume of these brick boxes, that then delineate how you would choose to use these spaces, based on a priority that is based on need, or on a certain way to occupy it, or a certain dimension that would enable several people to be in a space. So that's really the sort of generative idea, that the land gives a clue to the method of how we build. I think you can see some of that stuff melting on the edge of the roof. I'm not sure in this image. Again, partly I want to talk about this idea of building in brick and lime. Now, if you notice, all the bricks, these are actually bricks that are thrown away. The black bricks, the colored bricks, are the bricks that are actually thrown away. And what we discovered, because we were looking for actually a good quality brick that was fired well, and we discovered the bricks that were fired the most were the bricks that were being thrown away, and they were these black bricks. And you normally collect them just before the monsoons, because a lot of the brick building is sort of local, small entrepreneurs who have a rice field, and they use their rice field before the rain set in to make the bricks. So that's how, and you can see these are the kilns. So all the periphery, the bricks that are on the periphery are fired more. And what we did was start collecting these bricks from one brick source to the other. And of course, they discovered where these bricks were going, and soon the prices of these bricks started sort of rising. But they're very beautiful, the nature of these bricks, the diversity in terms of what they bring in terms of color. And, but it's also just the oxides, the metal that's embedded. So if one had to do an archaeology, you could sort of soon discover a whole language that's kind of embedded in these bricks. There's a sort of DNA of that region, of that soil. But anyway, these are just images that we constantly are taking. There's a book called Studies that we've just published. We don't have an ISBN number, but I'm going to try and get that out. But this is just documenting a landscape that we're constantly inspired by, a changing landscape where all kinds of phenomena exist, from gas stations to potters, to rice fields, and just the juxtaposition of this. All along India, if you drive, more so now, between Udaipur and Ahmedabad, or north to south, east to west, there's these incredible sectional cuts where these highways have been cut through. And you can still see sort of an evolution, it's a whole sort of cultural evolution that you can actually view in this sectional cut, where you see all these different kinds of inhabitation coexisting next to each other. I'm not sure. I'm hopeful that part of it will remain, but we're going to see a rapid change of this landscape. Again, it's more just to be able to document things that we see. Then these are models, brick kilns that you saw in the earlier slides, in this earlier slide here. So what we've done is studied these kilns, because now we have to work with bricks. Working with wood is now quite expensive. One could have done that 10 years ago, and it's multiplied tenfold. And I was talking to at lunch today, and just to give you an idea, so if we say that more than half the population, that's 500 million people, build their projects, or the built landscape of India is built outside the framework of architecture, we still have about 50 million bricklayers to our disposal. Just to give you a sense of just that idea of what there is, or the potential there is to harness. So here, these are just studies that we're doing in the studio. The making of brick kilns. These brick kilns are then fired within the studio. So we are actually able to make small little, bricks and make models from them. You can see these are actually all models, brick models of brick kilns. But this then led to a project we were doing in Ahmedabad. It's again quite dry there. Of course, the weather patterns have changed there. But we had, what we found was that the soil was very good, and so all the soil, all the mud that came out from the excavation for the foundations was actually converted into a compressed earth block. Very simple device. We developed a machinery that actually allowed us to make them as plates. So they were, I think, 360 by 450. I think I have the dimensions wrong, but anyway, they were big sort of big brick plates, and about 2 inches thick. So these are actually 3 houses that are wrapped around a large courtyard. Again, what was important here was the walls, I think, if I'm correct, they're about 18 inches and in some places 21 inches thick. But the idea that the first 2 inches they're sort of sacrificed to weather and time, that through a process of erosion, that at the onset of every monsoon, the house in some ways sort of pushed into the ground. It sort of is, slowly bashed into the ground, but in a sort of sensitive way, where there's an erosion that takes place. The erosion in some way acts as a protective system, and I can maybe show you some, the next set of images might hold that. But it was, again, very simple to build this project. And for us, actually, what was most important in building the project was to develop a mortar joint. Because if you have about 40 or 50 bricklayers, or let's say 20 bricklayers, we're interested in finding the mean average of skill. So you have a skill of workers that is very high, and a skill of workers that might not necessarily be, so skillful. And so the idea is to operate somewhere in between. So the joint, which is the part that actually connects the bricks, was actually what we spent time on to figure out what is the optimum dimension based on how long it would also take for this to be built. So the timing, the skill force that we had was what determined the joint between the brick. That's the rains. So it's been, I think it's now the second year. And it's quite interesting because when I was talking about gravity, that the house slowly is being pushed in, the trees are emerging out, and there's this idea of scale and proportion that is taking place. It's a sort of changing scale and proportion. And it's quite interesting because the inhabitants of the house, it was an interesting comment they made, was that every time they come back, even if they leave for a week and come back, the house in some way has changed. It's not the same house that they left 4 days ago. So the idea that architecture in some way has the potential to breathe, to grow, to exist much in the way that you and I do. Again, this idea of time, coming back to constructing in lime was that it's the first material that actually formalized architecture, that took it out from the caves and where we were able to build straight walls. And lime as a material actually betters the moment it's formed. That means it's like a subatomic particle that's ever expanding. Cement or concrete, on the other hand, the day it's formed, is slowly dismantling itself. It weakens. So again, this idea that our perception, the way we perceive time, and that's just our conditioning, is that our idea of time is, the day we are born to the day we die. But what if we ask the question that this idea of time in the way that we know it or the way that we perceive it can extend beyond those boundaries? So that's something that I've been wanting to connect with this fascination that I have right now in constructing with this material called lime as an ever-expanding universe. And of course, within that, there are these ideas of embodied energy, but I don't want to go into that right now. And I think part of that has what in some way is delineating some of the work that we're doing now. I think this is upside down. It's okay. That's actually rain coming into the center of one of the rooms. This is a water tank. It's quite hot, so we can use this idea of passive cooling. But again, it's just it's a water space within the courtyard of the house, and the color actually comes from the peacocks. I don't have any images of the peacocks, but this entire house has actually been built there were 40 peacocks, wild peacocks, that inhabit this land and have been inhabiting it for a long time. And that was actually part of the motivation to not bring any trucks in, to use the excavation, to use what was found on site, to develop everything locally on site. Everything was moved in a way that we would not displace the peacocks. It was quite interesting that while the construction was going on, they just moved maybe 10, 15 feet away from the periphery of this construction site. And the moment the house has been occupied, they're here every morning, every evening, actually being part of the space. But the way I imagined this was that I've not put the plan, but there's a big platform which is the large living room of the house. And it's much like a dance hall, it's like a theater, just like a stage like this, where one could imagine this mythical idea that this house where you was actually filled with peacocks, and there's a performance of peacocks within this house. So that's really what it is, this project. So a lot of it is actually just outdoor open space, and the rooms are maybe less than 50% in this particular project that you actually occupy. This image is of these shelters that are made in mines where they quarry stone for construction. So Fatehpur Sikri, for example, the possibility that the stone could have come from this place. But I'm just showing you this image just as an idea of the potential of landscape. And so it doesn't really necessarily rain in these regions. And of course, in March, in this part of Rajasthan, which is up north, there was a heavy rain and sort of flooded this quarry, and we sort of were able to capture this picture of this landscape that remains latent underneath to be discovered. But what's quite interesting is these structures are built to actually take rest under, because there are no trees in this landscape. So these are actually shelters to have lunch and to rest. And it's quite interesting, as they keep moving, they build these shelters and keep leaving these shelters behind. So you have this incredible landscape of these pavilions that have been left behind rather than being abandoned. They get built, left behind, and this is sort of incredible landscape. Just showing this to you as something that for us is a generator of ideas. This is a project in the north, at the base of the Himalayas, in a place called Dehradun. And this is for a lady who's Japanese. She's Japanese in origin. She has been spending 6 months of the year in India over the last 25, 30 years. And, she came to the studio, and the idea was the way that the conversation started was that could we produce a project much in the way that she builds or she produces her work. So she's a farmer, cultivates the cocoons, cultivates indigo, grows the crop at the day of no moon, cultivates it on the day of full moon, so on and so forth. And the dyes, the threads, all of that is made. Here I'm showing you the image of the flow of the river. These are the big rivers of India, Yamuna, the Ganges, that flow through this. And for me, the interest is this sort of landscape that is revealed as the river flows. It's sort of through the action of erosion, something is revealed from the ground. And you can see here, so part of the whole basis of this project was that construction and cultivation both would begin at the same time. And the idea of cultivation, to bring cultivation into this aspect of building, was also a sense of care that then would be taken in the process of building. So the building, the building site or the site is not just this bombarded landscape. Again, the diagram to the left that you see, it sort of faces up, looks up east. So it's sort of this gesture of an embrace, but actually catches the sun and the moon in the courtyard, and the idea of the rising of the moon. But more importantly, and in the later slides, you see these river stones. They actually have a kind of phosphorescence, because when you pass by on a full moon night and you see these dried riverbeds, there's this sort of light emitting out of these riverbeds because it has this kind of phosphorescence in the stone. So what we've done is actually crushed the stones and mixed it with lime, and we're eventually going to do a wash over the bricks in some way to seal the bricks, but also this idea of the potential that the building, on a day of the full moon can actually emit its own light. Just the idea that architecture has that quality or that kind of potential embedded with it. That's a line-out diagram. All of us registering the marks or the points. The clients are also actually engaged just to give them a sense of dimension and distance and volume that the space would hold or contain. These are all the tools, some of the things that we use directly on the site. Again, you see the image to the top left. It's a lime, a place where they slake the lime. So everything is within a 5-kilometer radius. The stones are, a few kilometers away. The lime comes from a few kilometers away, and so does the brick. And in the process, the people building, all also come from near proximity or the close neighborhoods of the place. This is just some of the things. I think the client is there, the lady here in the second image at the extreme bottom, facing us. And you can see just all the tools, and I've just sort of put this image just to give you a sort of quality of the materials. Again, it's quite interesting, this yellow silk cocoons, this kind of golden yellow silk cocoons, and it was quite interesting. We were having dinner one evening, and the masons who are building this project, they all come from a place in West Bengal. And my client, Chiaki, was talking, and I asked this young boy, I said, I know you come from Bengal, but which part do you come from? And he said, Maldar. And she quickly perked up and said, Maldar silk. And he said, yes. And then went on to describe the entire process. So he and this entire village, so we have about 20 of them working on this particular site, their entire families, for generations, all they've done is cultivated this particular cocoon to draw out this kind of silk. So he knew the entire process of making silk thread. And this was a mason who was actually building with brick in this project. So just interesting, this idea what we talk about, tacit knowledge, embedded latent potential, and all these kind of come through in conversations, through gestures. Here just the line out, an idea of action of drawing, of making lines on the site. So just trying to sort of reveal the atmosphere of the place. And again, the sense of this idea of the foundation that is discovered through a process of erosion, through the process of this water that flows on the mountain that slowly over time sort of peels away the layers, this erosion that takes place to reveal a sort of internal landscape of the ground. So that's the drawing. I don't know if you can even see it. Sorry. You can imagine it. So you can see this, it's very simple device. These excavations are made, doesn't require a very high skill. Rocks that are found from the river or mined from the river or collected from the river are basically thrown in, and it's all thrown in a lime bed. And this again is tied into a seasonal cycle. So just before the rains, we kind of have to stop the construction, or we have to know what has to be done when, at what point of the year, when you work with lime. And I think maybe that's part of the reason why over a period of time it has slowly vanished or has slowly been obscured from the language of architecture. I'm very fascinated, and I love to design the foundations of buildings. It's like an iceberg in a way that, what's underneath in some way describes what's above, or what's above, you can sort of get a sense of what's below. So it's, for me, the idea of what's not seen, for me, is far more important than actually what's seen. And again, tying back to this idea of what does interiority and exteriority mean, and is it something that is also within us, this idea of interiority and exteriority as a spatial idea. So again, the idea of making foundations as a spatial idea, not just holding up a certain kind of weight, but that it can describe or inscribe a certain sense of proportion of what is above the ground. That's the diagram, a sort of quick diagrammatic model. This is what it is. This was, I think, 7 months ago. And you can see the relationship in the landscape. Again, I've imagined this in some ways. It's been built with the idea that it sort of predates the Mughals, goes back a few hundred years, and we still have the potential to build like this. And here was the idea to demonstrate, that this is still possible. It's not, again, being a nostalgic idea, but demonstrate from the idea of speed, demonstrate from the idea of economics, and demonstrate from the idea of the potential of what is embedded in this kind of method of making. Again, there's this idea that the walls are walls. It's quite interesting because we're now beginning to do a project in Switzerland where the idea is to take this and transfer that technology, or actually the technology does exist out there, but where walls are real walls, there's no air gap and insulation and 2 inches of this and 3 inches of that, where it's just pure solid mass. But anyway, just to give you a sense of the relationship to the landscape, and part of it was conceived in this way as a sort of odd anomaly building that it could have existed as a stable, a saraghar, which is like a rest stop, a rest house. It could have been a fortification. So in a sense, there's no program really. There's just these 4 bars. You can see these 4, and part of it has been skewed. So in a way, it's actually a square, and we're negotiating a square. The square has been shifted because of the thrust of the flow of the water coming down from the mountain. That has kind of opened it up. And in some ways, this diagram, if I want to call it, if we call it that, remains neutral to east, west, north, south. That it remains open to east, west, north, south. And that one could actually enter and exit through these openings, east, west, north, south. Again, what you see on the edges of the photograph of this model is really this idea of fortification, or this idea of delineating, just keeping the landscape in check or at bay. I don't know if you can see this very well, but it's okay. So all of it is constructed with, these are the brick walls that the rat trap bond. We have stone beams. And it's quite interesting because once a system is set up, the people actually, the guys who are making this, or the people making this, know it intrinsically. They know it intuitively of what has to follow next. So in a sense, what we've really given here, we don't have very complex drawings for this. We just have the sort of broad dimensions. We stake out, the model is there, and then the rest is just a sequence, in a way like sequence of numbers, or like a musician would play, once you've given the right notes in the right sense, or the story behind that piece of music. And it's exactly the same way. The idea of materiality in some way is prescribed more from an intuitive tacit understanding, where there's a sequence that actually allows the building to unfold. This was our studio. This is just all the development, the research that goes into the making. And those are the little bricks that modeled there. You can see that those are actually little bricks that we fired. And in some way also what it does is allows the young interns in the studio, other people who might not necessarily are not necessarily architects, or the ladies who actually made the bricks, they all can actually participate in making this. And while you make it, you immediately know that something works or doesn't work. So there's a sort of immediacy in the tools that are used. I would say these are all mechanisms, instruments that enable us to make architecture. This is the quarry where the slabs are being made, are being cut. So actually all the slabs sit on timber beams. They're about 5 feet in width and 22 inches wide, and split quite easily. You can see there's just very quick, easy means to split them. That's our structural test, and that's my client jumping on it. It's about 14 feet apart. So these are again just tests, just to understand, the different kinds of stone that are available in the riverbed, and we kind of separated them. And of course, eventually the idea is to just mix them all together. But these were just tests to understand, the potential of what might be there. So it's again more to delete out something that we might have missed. So these are again just the process or the practice of just making things and inquiring about things that are important to the project. That's our reinforcement, because we use lime. It's a bamboo tied with a silk thread, very strong, because this silk thread is used as fishing nets. So it's all, it's very complex, this relationship of the guys building, the place they come from, the action of fishing. That's all interconnected in some way. This idea of culture, of an ontology, of a landscape, just there's all of these things embedded. And again, this is that black stuff that you saw on the roof on the boat. So that's actually used as the protection. And then this is set down into the foundations as reinforcement. And you can see these are women that can participate very easy. They know how to weave, they know how to make these things, and all they're doing is transferring that technology, if you want to call it, into the action of making rebar. That's the rat trap bond that I was talking about. It was actually developed by a British engineer after World War II, a gentleman by the name of Laurie Baker, who settled in India, and his primary motive was to actually provide housing for the extremely, extremely poor. So there were houses that were to be built for less than 5,000 rupees, which would be less than $100. This was in the 60s, but he was the man who actually came up with the idea of building this kind of a brick wall. So again, it's important, this idea of a warp and weft that occurs between colonization and agriculture, this kind of continuous warp and weft that one is interested in bringing into the project. The way the water flows, the force of the site, how indigo is grown in these fields, then made into dyes, taken to the washing area, the water that runs off, then comes back to these fields. So it's a sort of continuous cyclical process that is occurring all the time, but only through use, only through work. The idea that through work, there is a nourishment to the place, to the landscape. That's what it is, taken a few days ago. This idea of an embodied elegance in the action of making architecture. Thank you.